much more than an hour talking about this and engaging in conversation about this topic. So I'll dive in with the quick intro. Thank you all for being here at our third now MIVPAC, Minnesota Injury and Violence Prevention Action Coalition webinar, reviewing the state plan that we created about maybe a year and a half ago, where we really outlined this framework about shared risk and protective factors that we have seen with our injury and violence prevention community, and also through the research. We've identified these 5 factors that are shared among injury and violence prevention, where we feel like if we come together and we focus on these 5 factors, we can really move the needle in prevention work around the state. So we met back in, I guess, November now, and reviewed the whole plan. Or I'm sorry, that was probably October. We reviewed the whole plan. Then in November, we started to focus in on these shared risk and protective factors, starting with a discussion about health equity, which was fantastic. We took a break in December because everyone is always very busy there. And now we're back together in the new year to kick things off again with our final factors. And I think it's great to kick it off with this factor of community connectedness. Sometimes it's called community cohesion. There are a lot of different names for it, but it's really the power of community and how that can be used as a prevention tool. So as we go through this conversation here, and I think it's going to be a great back and forth discussion, I encourage folks to think about a couple questions. How can each of us address this topic? Who do we need to work with? Who's not at our table here or at each of our individual organizational tables that should be there in this discussion? What are the 2 most important things that you want to do right now and that you have the capacity to do? And then also looking a little bit beyond that, what are the next 2 things that you want to do, but you might need different or more resources? And really think about what are those resources, and how can we come together as a group and perhaps step in and be that resource or work together to meet that need. So I'm really excited to have with us today some great speakers on the topic. Okay, great. Oh, thanks so much, Glenn, for that message in the chat. Perfect. So we have some great folks from Men as Peacemakers here. We have Noelle Volin and Sarah Curtis from Men as Peacemakers, which is an organization that aims to end violence against women and children. Specifically, Men as Peacemakers focuses on preventing sexual assault, dating violence, and domestic violence perpetrated against women, girls, and boys. And every program at Men as Peacemakers is rooted in community. A core belief of their organization is that when individuals come together, they can transform their communities. And we were going to have Jennifer White, but I believe she's out sick. And so we have her colleague, Glenn Burt, who is stepping in. Thank you so much for being here. And Glenn joins us from the Minneapolis Office of Violence Prevention, where they treat violence as a public health issue and work with the community to find solutions, recognizing that community disconnectedness impacts the incidence and prevalence of violence. So I'm really excited to have them here. And I have a list of questions to kind of run through and frame this conversation, but also I encourage them to talk to each other. And also, I think we'd probably be comfortable with some chat questions or folks joining in the conversation. We'll focus on the panel for about 20 minutes, but if there's good conversation going on and we're all involved, then, this is really a space for us all to come together as a community. So I'm happy to let the panel go longer. But also we want to save some time to just make sure that there is discussion so that folks on the line can really figure out how do we take community connectedness, incorporate it into our work, and really come together as a community as we're all working towards the prevention of injury and violence in Minnesota. So if we're ready, Glenn, if you're ready to join us, you can feel free to keep your camera off or join us on camera, but I think I'll ask the question and I'll ask, hey, great to have you. And I'll
Hey.
have Menace Peacemakers kick it off, and then we'll go to Glenn, and then we can switch back and forth and do whatever our panelists and our audience wants to do. So also after this first question, if I missed anything in the introduction, please feel free to correct me and expand on what I said. So our first question is, how have you seen, or how do you see community connectedness as an injury and violence prevention tool? It's a big one. So Noelle or Sarah, would you like to lead us off?
I can start. Bonjour, Indidwe Mahogany Dog. Hello, relatives. I am currently at a training in St. Paul in this very weird basement room, so I'm hoping that my Wi-Fi works out. So good to be here with you all. Sarah Curtis, she, hers. I'm the executive director for Menace Peacemakers. And, that question, it is a big one and it is not at the same time. Because when you think about it, when we're talking about, addressing, factors that are causing folks harm, when we're talking about violence that is happening in the community, how is it humanly possible to do that work if we are not actually connected to the community? It's been, transitioning in this year is my 20th year being able to work in this field. Really easy math. I started when I was 20. I just turned 40. So that was very wise of me to start at an even number. But having in that position, and I got into this work because I am a survivor of violence. I come from a community that experiences a lot of violence. And that is what drove me to do the work that I do, because I know what it feels like to be that person, right? That person experiencing harm. And at Menace Peacemakers and in the work that we do is that, it kind of sounds cliche at times where it's like, we need to hear from the community. We work and serve the community, but it is so true. When you have those connections and that you're dedicated to not just making incremental movements, but taking giant leaps towards change, you cannot do that solo, right? You actually have to not just be in, but be of the community. People knowing you, what you stand for, the work that you do, so that they'll stand and walk beside you in moving the change. Is that, I tell people all the time at MAP, we're not just sitting, we have a very skinny tall building downtown in Duluth, but it is no ivory tower, right? We're not just sitting there and being like, oh, what would be cool to do with the community today? Maybe we should try this. We are going to events. People are coming in our building. We're talking to people. The staff is out there and we're literally hearing every program. And if you're unfamiliar with MAP, we are 100% a prevention organization. And all of our programs, everything we've done has a creation story that comes from a need based in the community. Even if some of the work is more statewide and not local, it literally comes from a need in the community and being connected in the community enough to see where the problems lie, what the needs are, and how they would like us to serve them. And so when we talk about how community connectedness, I think it is quite impossible to do the work without being connected in community. And I'll pass. Noelle, if you want to say something more.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you all for being here and joining in on this conversation. And everything Sarah said, I've learned from her. So everything Sarah said, I truly appreciate. But I also wanted to add, just from the perspective of somebody who has worked in spots where folks, the feedback is like, you are in an ivory tower. This is really what I have learned from Sarah, from doing community-based work, is that we can get into a cycle of saying certain words, right? Victim-centered, trauma-informed, right? These are things that we put in place in our RFPs, and we put in place, in the language that we use to describe who we are to the community. And we're trying to get everybody on the same page with what we mean by definitions. And we are working in a victim-centered way. And all of this is like digging in to try and show and demonstrate that we are connected to community, and that the decisions that we're making and the programming that we're developing is being done with the victim in mind. And sometimes it sticks up here, right? And it's kind of weird that we are talking about connectedness, because I think for a lot of cultures and practices, being connected in community is just intuitive. It's a part of who we are. It's a part of our daily practice. But then if we get into professional realm, it's not always set up to do that. And so sometimes there's a little like dissonance there, and disconnect already built into these systems that we're a part of, even if what we're bringing to the table is this sense of, well, in my faith community or in my cultural community, we practice this all the time. And so having systems in place that are not set up to incorporate that whole person, and then also an awareness of like, oh, we're set up in a disconnected way. Let's layer on these like terms, let's layer on these processes, and then try and get back to that connectedness. Sarah, like you said, it's like, it's actually not as big. We can get back down to this real common sense connecting part of humanity. It's just sort of a reorientation and it's a mental, emotional, physical practice of like, how are we actually reorienting ourselves to this work so that when we say those words, like we are connected to community at an organizational level, or we say victim-centered, or we say trauma-informed, what does it actually look and feel like? What does that mean in practice for you as an individual? How, if you have a position of influence, how is that actually factoring into the way you run your organization? And I say this like from somebody who's been a part of organizations where we've said the words, and I think there's intention behind it, but the like actual implementation of doing it hasn't always been there. And now coming in an organization where I'm like, oh, okay, I see what this is like. And so there's just sort of just this need to acknowledge that it's maybe not built into your organization or system, but it could also very well be a part of who the individuals that make up your like organizational community. It's probably already part of who they are. And so being open to integrating some of those things that will actually, once you reorient, feel really intuitive once you start doing it. And I want to pass it over to Glenn. Glenn, I want to make sure I get it
Yes,
right because you have Bert, comma Glenn.
it's Glenn.
Glenn.
Glenn's first
Okay,
name.
thank you, sir.
Yeah,
I'll pass it over to you.
no problem. Wow. What you've all said is um, very enlightening. And to give everyone a little bit of my background, I've been in the Office of Violence Prevention for about a year and a half now. We were, but I actually supervise a group called Community Navigators, which operate out of the police department in Minneapolis. And so the Office of Violence Prevention approaches violence prevention from a public health standpoint, whereas the community navigators, the whole concept behind them is that we have people embedded within the PD who represent various communities, most of the time historically underserved or marginalized communities. And for us, connectedness is finding people who are from said community, who operate within that community, who act as bridges and conduits for both education and information. And that connectedness comes from them being trusted agents, both within and outside of the department, but also being ciphers sometimes for officers who um, all too often operate within a community, but they don't feel a part of it. That us versus them, um, being a cipher for them and also being a barrier to allow them to ask questions, because historically, uh, officers have been very resistant to just asking a question about why something happens the way it happens. Um, the great thing about the navigators, at least in my opinion, and being intentional and mindful of them, is allowing them the freedom to office in community, work in community, become, utilize those natural and, like, I believe Noel said, intuitive connections. But understanding, the hardest part was getting them to understand the police mindset, right? And bringing them in and onboarding them to understand where you work at, but then being able to translate that into what I call lay language back out to community. And then having community, just as officers do, come together and ask questions of the same person, and being able to transfer that information back and forth. Um, it's been very successful. And in many ways, it's been a model for us to sort of kind of build upon, to say, hey, um, this community, I have to give a story, and I'm sorry, that's the way my mind works. Um, I once had an officer who was a canine officer who was operating in North Minneapolis, um, which historically is the Black part of Minneapolis. And he pulled me aside and said, Glenn, I just got this question. And I said, okay, shoot. And he said, well, I take my dog out at the park because it's a dog and I want him to stretch his legs and, go potty and everything else. And he said, the kids always see me with the dog and run off. And he said, I'm not, he says, that's suspicious, right? And I said, no, that's safety. And I had to explain to him the history of police and dogs with Black people. I said, I'm from Ohio, but my family history is in Mississippi and Alabama. You know, that safety has been passed on to me, and it continues. It's at this point, it's just about genetic. And to really help officers understand that, for him to say, oh, so when my dog was activating, I said, well, that's probably a training issue, because who do you use as your suspects when you train? And he had to go back and go, oh, and I said, yeah, remember, you're training something to react to something else. You're not training it unbiasedly. And just to have someone within the PD to be trusted for that officer to ask that question, I've helped change their whole entire outlook on how they train their dogs and what they see. Because this person didn't grow up in the cities. He didn't know history. America teaches history poorly. Um, and to put it mildly, but to literally sit down and be within a PD, and I've been with the department. I've worked in the department for 26 years. Um, I can have these conversations and be honest with them, and they can be honest with me about what they don't know. Or sometimes I can bring information, or my team can bring information, um, about a community that officers didn't know what's going on, because in many cases, the most affected communities, there's a history behind it. There's a reason why they don't like police. And many officers aren't taught that. They don't understand the damage that's been done and that you may continue to do, because, as I like to say, everyone knows the officer from here down. It's their job to get the community to know you from here up, so that you become human to them, they become human to you. And now you can actually have you can think about violence prevention from a holistic standpoint. Your presence may help prevent some violence, but you're also the best repositors of information about what's actually going on in community, because you're called first. And if you simply utilize your discernment, but also your understanding of what's going on when things go wrong, you could be a great repositor to help communities. It's not about what you can do with your hands. Sometimes it's what you can do to say, hey, I showed up for another story, I showed up on a domestic violence incident or call, and two people are fighting. And what they're really fighting about is a lack of resource. There's not enough food. The water's turned off. Instead of just arresting somebody to take them out, which is state statute, you should be also talking to talking to one of my navigators to say, hey, this family needs food. That's what they're fighting about. It's the end of the month and they've run short. If we get food there, if we can turn that into a resource building opportunity, guess what? We measure our effectiveness by that officer not having to go back to that address. That family being successful in just dealing with, their hand to mouth issues. Because in many cases, that's what you're seeing. You're not seeing violence for the sake of violence. You're seeing people frustrated and not knowing where the resources are or having the wherewithal or the personal tools to know how to get those. And I'm sorry, I get on my soapbox a little bit, but from a police department standpoint, um, it's not about arresting community. Protecting community sometimes is helping people. It's really about service and realizing that you're the face of this. You have the most power in this to affect the most change, because in a perfect world, all you're doing is driving around and waving to people. You're never getting out the car because no one's in a violent situation. You're just there for emergencies. And that's where we're trying to build a better world to. And to me, that's violence prevention in a way that is very tactile, hands-on, and front-facing. The problem is that we're slowly but surely changing the mindset, and that's a difference. That's the uphill climb that we've had for the last 4 years now. So sorry, I'll get off my soapbox, and I hope that answered the question.
No, that was great. And don't apologize. We invited you to go on your soapbox here. That's the panel. No, I think that's amazing. And I took from all of your responses. I was furiously typing notes, but there's so much that overlaps with our last conversation that we had about health equity as well, which is not surprising, but just this idea of this being a practice, and something that you continue to practice, and giving that space, like you were mentioning, Glenn, to have honest conversations where you're a little vulnerable, and but the outcome is so powerful and so necessary. So I think that that's just it's really great. I was typing down keywords of just increasing honesty, increasing understanding, and this idea of Glenn, you telling stories, but also that idea that community is about stories and sharing these stories so that everyone can learn, and move forward with that prevention work. So thank you for all of that. I'll move us on to our next question, which is, how do you see connectedness on the individual and also the organizational levels? How do we look at this through a public health lens? And you all kind of have touched upon this already, but how are these levels different, and is one better than the other or more effective than the other? Can you talk a little bit about that? And I know I have to give my context that I've worked with Noel closely and do know that they do a lot of talking about the difference between the individual level of community connectedness and also the organizational level of connectedness. And I think it's a really interesting take on things, especially as we gather here as representatives of different organizations and agencies, coming together for this conversation.
Do you want me to go, or do you want to kick it off, Noel? Okay. So Glenn, I want to have a cup of coffee with you after listening. That I can definitely, it's exciting to me that I see that, the mythology around this is like, there's just good pockets of people doing the work. But in the reality of my experience is that I continually come across people who I have yet to meet that are having, this kind of impact. And when I think about this question, and I'm very grateful to have Noel on this call, because sometimes I get into the 100,000-foot view, and Noel is very good at tapping me back onto the ground. But having, when we look at it, is like, we really need to look at this as, weaving, because we have all seen, individuals that have been around, that the community trusts, that are connected to an organization, and those people leave, an organization or move on to a different one, and then people are wondering, or programs move and fall apart. And so it is really critical to build that connection, not just with individuals, but on an organizational level. And when I talk about weaving, right, is that we're relationship building is not a luxury item. You know, oftentimes, and I know I'm like in a room with prevention nerds, so I feel very comfortable saying this, but like, you know, oftentimes people look at prevention as a luxury item if we get all of the intervention stuff done, if we get the critical needs. And it is so critical to have both aspects of that when we're talking about community change. And as we're, you know, really doing this work, building community connectedness, that relationship building are those threads that we start weaving together. You know, so much as like open houses in our org so people can come, you know, not be intimidated by the building we're housed in, you know, going to those community events, listening to people, the good conversations, the hard conversations, and slowly building that fabric, right? And that we need to make sure that we're taking the time to weave that fabric tight enough that it can withstand bouncing once bouncing happens. Because when you're working and you're doing that deep community connectedness, is that we're talking about a lot of populations, whether it be racial, cultural backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, religious-based backgrounds, gender identity backgrounds, like folks who are, you know, some on the margins of the margins, right? And that it does take that time to build that safety with them to hear what the true cause is. And with that, you know, sometimes we're the problem. Right. And so then once the very funny thing that happens is when you build those connections, you hear, you know, I think about storytelling. This why I want to have coffee with you, Glenn, because I feel like storytelling is the big thing. I remember one day in my office just doing my thing, chained to the computers, executive directors often are, and a community member walked right in, walked right up, walked right in, shut the door and said, I need to tell you everything you're doing wrong. And I was like, oh, okay. Right. And having that kind of conversation, but it came to the place where he trusted me. You know, he trusted me to be able to have that kind of conversation. And I think about one story in particular. There was a safety audit that was done in Duluth with Native women who had experienced sexual violence. And one of the things that came out after doing focus groups, I'm so sorry, my Mac is like connected to my phone, but is that what came out of interviewing 120 different Native women is that they wanted their own support group, culturally specific. And I was like, oh, that's an immediate response that I can do to like come in and do in the community. So I started hosting the groups and nobody came. Nobody. Now I've been around the block. These are my streets. This is my res. Like people know who I am. And I am not, you know, I have crazy colored hair, but I definitely am not considered intimidating. And I was like, why? Why? Why are people? And it was like weeks of this. I like got good food. I like tried to put it out there. I was like, I'm not just getting Domino's, y'all. Like we're getting some famous Daves up in here. Like come here. Right. Nobody came. And so then I, you know, put on my sneakers and went into the street. And I was like, this is a identified need from the people in community that have a bunch of, you know, risk factors, folks that identified that, you know, Native women didn't feel comfortable and confident in the mainstream services, specifically asked 120, like 90% of them specifically asked for culturally specific groups. And so I went, you know, I put on my sneakers, talked to people, asked people to come. And there was a woman, she's passed a few years ago. I always use Jane Doe, John Doe, Minnesota small. But Jane Doe she was an elder, a Native elder, and she was a chronic alcoholic. You know, she's someone who lived on and off the street, but very much a community leader. And so I had her and some other, and I was sitting in there and I was like, Jane, can you tell me what I'm doing wrong? Like what, after we got food, and she's like, oh, we need some music. Like put on, Indians love the old country. So like put on some of that country music. I was like, okay, I can pull up. And then I was like, but it doesn't make sense. And finally, with clarity, she looked right at me and said, Sarah, no one wants to come to the sexual assault building. No one wants to be seen walking in. And I was like, right? And something that I would have never been able to respond to had I not actually been connected in community. And I changed it. I was able to go to a local tribal urban office and get space from them. And it was a flourishing and functioning group. And so, when we look at that, building that fabric, right, is that we can't skip those steps organizationally or individually. We actually have to ride out all of those steps, because if you don't have trust in the community, then, you can quite easily get lumped, and rightfully so, as an organization that's just coming in to place a mandate in community instead of walking side by side with folks.
I always watch
Oh,
the other panelists to see if they're gonna like make a move.
well,
And then are
oh,
they gonna unmute or do I unmute? So Glenn, did you wanna go first?
sure. Yeah, I was getting ready to. I just didn't want to overstep. Wow. Okay, back to the original question. Um, hold on. Please restate the question again, just to make sure I have it.
Sure, I know. So it's a question about how do you see connectedness on the individual and organizational level, and how do we look at
Okay.
that through a public health lens, and if you see one being more important or more effective than another.
Okay. Sarah threw me off when she said coffee because I love coffee. So I'm, you know, just trying to think of all the places in Duluth I know that have coffee. But I guess for me and for our outlook, it's kind of both and. Um, Individually, I tried to make sure as I describe it to my team, we are building our own universe. The goal is for you to be able to operate in both sides, both within the organization and outside the organization. How we mindfully worked in the organization is we treated we treated them as subject matter experts on the communities that they serve. Um, Individually, the navigators for the group, African American, Native American, LGBTQI plus, um, East African, Somali, and Latinx, and last but not least, survivors of domestic violence. We have an active navigator who is embedded within the department. Um, the idea of them within the department, we do historical training as part of our procedural justice efforts. So each of the navigators was able to inform the entire department about the history of their communities, and from the past up through today, what does that mean when you work within that community? What's going on within that community to help officers better understand? Because most of them didn't grow up here, they don't interact that much. Um, the idea that police in general only work with 3 to 6% of any population. That doesn't matter if it's Minneapolis or Mayberry. It's you really don't deal with a lot of people. Um, so your mindset can be shrunk really small on what you see. But the idea of also organizationally, we have to create an ethos that, we serve all of these different people. And I even take it another level further, and I think about it from a customer service standpoint. Um, we have touch points, right? As organizations, as individuals. As an individual, people know me. Part of my organizational identity is that I'm an employee of the police department. Um, the goal is for me to be helpful. So if community knows me as helpful, then I become a go-to. It doesn't matter who it is. Someone's going to say, hey, if you got a question or you got an issue, you can call Glenn, right? That becomes part of the identity. And that's another part of that connectedness. Now, internally, there are those in the department who say, hey, I know you've worked over here. Can you help me with something? Or, I try to be mindful of the organization and what we're doing and what keep things going, because in many cases, as we all well know, we all kind of get focused on our little thing, right? And that becomes our silo. I try to keep my eyes up and see everything, just my personality. But I believe that connectedness from an individual standpoint, once again, I go back to officers and I have to kind of balance that of, their job is to get people to know them individually. This is your area, this is your town, this is your part of the town. Um, that's your job, you know, um, because as we all probably know, if people in the community know this officer, there's a much different level of communication. You're not nameless, you're not faceless. My navigator's the same deal, same thing. I like them to be out, I like them to be seen, I like them to function and be helpful, serve. Uh, Internally, it's the same thing, because once again, you become a subject matter expert on what's going on in your community. And in our case, if something horrible is happening, or if there's a urgent need because it is reactionary, um, it's nice for sworn officers to have somebody they can call and say, hey, my domestic violence navigator, she probably gets called 5, 6 times a day to go on a ride, to go on a call, because officers they've learned and recognized that I may not know the right language. I know what I know, but I know what I don't know, which is most important. I can call Cece, and Cece is going to come with me, and I can take care of what I know how to take care of. I can make the scene safe. The CC can talk to a survivor or a victim in the right language, so I don't mess it up. I don't want to mess this up. And until I learn the right language, which they're also learning because it's a byproduct of being there with her, you know, um, those are those little educational moments that you see it in action, you can mimic it, you can learn it. Um, she's become a godsend because, like I said, she started out tied to her desk, and now half of her job, we can walk in and I can see a squad car come screaming up and go, CC, and I go, I'll see you later. Because I know they're trying to get her to go to a call to a place that they've been to multiple times, and they realize I have this resource in house that can help me do this better. And when they come back and talk to me or give me the anecdotes, they're like, man, we need 6 CCs. As a supervisor, as a program manager, it's like, yeah, I'm working on it, but we got one and she's great and she's doing this great and wonderful work. But it's helpful because they're learning so much more than just, you know, than what they learned in school or learned on the road, learned, out in the street. There's a different way. And once again, that's helping officers think of their job differently. And I think of that from a connectedness standpoint. The officers who do it get much better responses, and our survivors slash victims also get a different experience. And we're much more likely to get, how can I put this? Having someone there who they can trust, who they know understands where they're at, who speaks the right language, who meets them where they're at. We create safety plans. We create much better connections, and we've had a ton of success with that. And that also allows her to find those resources and get the survivors better connected than the officer who doesn't know, who hasn't got the resource map, who only has a certain set of skills. And so I think for us, at least, that's that organizational connectedness of us regaining trust with the police department, but also having an individual who's trusted on both sides. So does that make sense to everybody? I'm hoping I'm making sense, but it's just it the way it's kind of designed was the idea of, like, you need an individual who's connected, but who also represents the greater organization. And when the customers, because that's what I have to think about as customer, because if you think about it as a business, you're going to treat people much better. At least that's my experience. And just, it's a subtle mindset change. And I think that's going to be my gift to law enforcement, is rethink how you do business. It's not us versus them. It's, are you serving your customer? I mean, if you walk into Walmart, someone greets you when you come in, someone greets you when you leave out. It's a subtle thing, but you notice it if you don't see it. And just getting that change of mindset is kind of the long-term goal and strategy of how you do things. But I think that connectedness from both the individual and organization can be built in. It can happen. It just takes time, and it's a muscle that you have to kind of build up. And we're building it. And the idea being, now once I get 6 CCs, man, imagine what that connectedness is going to be. Sorry, off my soapbox again.
That was great. Actually, I loved it. I loved it because my brain sees connecting threads, and then there's like a little bit of like, oh, okay, I see how this fits within these like models and frameworks that we talk about all the time. And so one thing that I really loved about both Sarah's and Glenn's stories, and first of all, stories help us see things. They help us understand patterns, and there's themes that come out, and they are so valuable in terms of insight and how we connect like the theoretical to the on the ground work. And so the thing that I really loved about both Sarah and Glenn was they had located themselves as individuals within this entire ecosystem, right? Within the, if we talk about socioecological model, you can see in their stories how you had individual, and then you had relationship, and then you have organizations connecting together and working, and that turns into different policy and practice, right? So this is what we're talking about. A lot of the work that we do with organizations is helping them like connect that dot between who they are as individuals and then how they see themselves in the community ecosystem. What does a thriving ecosystem look like? And I think for a lot of public health folks, and if you've ever done any direct service, you know that one of the things that can strengthen a person's ability to thrive within community is to build up their support network and to make sure that they have what they need, and make sure that there's a sense of community cohesion and identity, and they're adding value. They feel like they're adding value from the community, and they feel like they're taking away value. They feel like they are a valued member. And that's like, CDC prevention speak for social connectedness or community connectedness at that level. But the reality is when you have that in community, you have accountability. There's less likelihood of experiencing violence and perpetrating violence because you're connected to people who love you and care about you and support you, right? And who are ingrained in your everyday life. And so when we're talking about locating ourselves, right? I think Sarah gave a good example of locating herself within the realm of domestic violence and setting up a group in the community. And Glenn, you were talking about, I'm kind of curious too if CC is the same CC from Family Partnership and Pride. She used to work there, but we can talk about that later because I know a great CC too. But just the work that you're doing in the community and using relationships and using those leveraging the personal relationships for like organizational policy and practice, right? When we understand that at an individual level, if you're more connected, if we have communities where every individual is more connected, they're less likely to perpetrate violence, they're less likely to experience violence. And that goes for everyone in community, regardless of the professional role they play. If you have officers that are more connected in community and they are held accountable and feel accountable to community, how is that going to impact how they do their job, right? So I'm not just referring to the members of society that don't necessarily have an authoritative role. I'm talking about everybody in community. What does it look like when we are all feeling a sense of responsibility toward one another? Okay, we sort of kind of get that, right? And if you're part of faith communities, that's already sort of built into how you do things. Different cultural communities, they already practice this. So then how do we translate that to the organizational level? Well, we had 2 perfect examples, right? Like we know that Cece's going to be there and she's going to, like, this is a practice now. When there's a call, you have somebody from the community who's going to be there that's going to talk, figure out needs, and find ways probably to de-escalate crisis situations, right? Sarah is going to be more connected and realize, oh, a change of venue is going to help. So that actually then you're not just seeing yourself as part of a community, you're understanding your influence and where you have a role to influence change. And then that change translates into policy and practice shift. And so, Glenn, like you said at the beginning, this is a both and. It has to be a both and, because you have these individuals. I mean, if you think about, we have precedent as a state, right, with safe harbor. Again, going back to what you pointed out, Catherine, this is a practice. When we practice, it means it's always done in imperfection. So I'm not going to hold this up as like the perfect example. It's just the example that I know. When we had the Jerry Vick task force for trafficking, this was started because a cop realized that maybe he shouldn't arrest somebody for engaging in prostitution. Maybe he should buy groceries, right? And I don't mean to romanticize any of that, but that's like the lore, right, of the story. And then we had John Choi, who's like, I'm not going to prosecute youth engaging in prostitution. Then other county attorneys followed suit. And then we had Safe Harbor, and we developed the No Wrong Door plan, right? So this was like watching individuals use their influence. And then eventually this worked up to statewide shifting on how we handle things. That's what we mean by the organizational practice. So we have these stories that perfectly capture what ultimately comes down to this like frame of mind. And you, Glenn, you brought up ethos of we have to orient ourselves to that of saying, this is somebody who is valued. I am a part of this community. I am going to use my influence to shift and change things. And we see change occurring. Sometimes it's like pushing a really huge boulder, and it's great when you can get other folks to come alongside you and push this boulder of change. But I think for Matt's perspective, when we talk about locating yourselves in the ecosystem, that's what we mean, because it's important to understand that at an individual level, to recognize that as you're helping individuals, you are also an individual that can start using your influence to change, and that starts building a community that is thriving. And a thriving community, violence prevention can occur, right? Like, it's not some theoretical or just a hopeful thing. This is an actual practical, yes, we are influencing these primary protective factors and growing this trust and growing this sense of connectedness that does have an impact. That's my soapbox. I'll step back off.
I want to just encourage everyone to stay on their soapboxes. I love hearing this. You're really just giving so much to think about and bringing it back into, I think, a really kind of applicable way to think about this, about community connectedness. And so with our last 10 minutes, like I said at the beginning, we could have a whole week-long, retreat about all of this. And wow, think of the things we could do if we got, funding to do that. That would be amazing. That's maybe next year. But I want to include now folks that are on here as our audience, and pose this question that Noelle actually just asked, which I think is what the big question is what does it feel like, or what does it look like when everyone feels accountable in their community? And really thinking about community as where each of us physically are. I think perhaps we have representation from across the state here, so we are all in different pockets of the state, so geographically, but also with MIVPAC here, with this group that continues to come together in community to have these conversations and to listen to our colleagues. What does MIVPAC look like if we are feeling accountable to each other in this community? I can think off the top of my head, it's showing up to these webinars and, and saying, I'm here for the discussion. I'm here to learn. I'm here to listen to how, to listen to these shared risk and protective factors. But I want to open it up, and that's just one question that I have. If folks want to take this in another direction, I also encourage you to put your questions in there. And if you have questions of our panelists too, I think we have a wealth of information here. So for the last 10 minutes, I'd love to have a discussion in community. And I'm kicking it off with this big question of what does it look like if we are held accountable to each other? And you can feel free to come off mute and speak with video or without, or use the chat.
If if I can, just to get us
Please.
started,
Yes.
I think what it looks like is the idea of what we're doing now, exchanging information. Um, it's celebrating the successes, but acknowledging the failures and also learning from those, because sometimes I think that in too many cases, the best intentions go awry because we haven't thought wide enough or deep enough, on something. But also acknowledging that, we're human, it's a human error. And sometimes it's like I said, it's the best of intentions. And sometimes things just fall apart because they do. But I think what that looks like for us is, you know, staying connected, sharing information, um, sharing the idea of resources. Because even if it's not local to you, it may spark an idea. It may spark something that, maybe I can't do it today, but if I nurture this thought, it can happen tomorrow. I can just say the community navigators, the idea of them started 17 years ago. And it literally was just me um, being a civilian worker for the chief and trying to put out fires that came up and happening to interact with different communities. And, if anybody didn't know, I'm a Black male from Ohio. I didn't grow up around certain communities growing up in a small town. Um, but I've been blessed. I've traveled the world in the military, so I've gotten comfortable and being able to sort of, when in Rome, become a Roman and acknowledge what I don't know, and literally just doing that and having one of my old supervisors finally become chief and say, okay, I need you to build me this. Like, remember what we used to do? Yes, build it. Okay, I don't know what that looks like, but we built it. And acknowledging that and realizing, yeah, there's been failures along the way and there's been, potholes and setbacks, but the overall idea is good. The overall concept is good. In practice, it's been great because it's not just my brain trying to work on it. Now it's a bunch of people working on it. And those are the successes, and acknowledging, man, having community come back to me and say, where's our navigator? Ah, you know, gap, I didn't have to identify the gap identified itself, and people are saying, I want that. And I think that's part of what we have to do on our work, because violence prevention, especially from a public standpoint, in many cases, we have the best of intentions, but you have to listen to the community to tell you what is preventative for them. You know, in many cases, it's you know, I don't need the police to show up to arrest somebody. I want you to come and be a part of us. Or, Glenn, I need you to show up and just give us information. That's preventative and that's wonderful. And, in many cases, it's about education. It's about information, and, never forgetting that we have a duty in this. And, once again, I think it's about ethos of how do we help with the least amount of harm. We're all trying to make the world better, and I think we can. It's just a matter of, you know, how that looks in your specific space. I'll jump off the
That's
soapbox
great.
again.
Thank you. I see we have a hand raised in the audience too, Leslie.
Hi, this is a question for Glenn. And I just am so fascinated by your navigators. And I'm just curious as to just like within a community, how does a navigator operate? How do you identify the problems or the the issues, and how do you get to know your community? And so, I don't know if
Um,
that's
well, I can say this. I was very intentional in how I hired. In many places, community navigators are basically social workers. I went in a different direction. I tried to find people who have, each of my navigators has a minimum of 10 years experience in social service work. Um, it didn't have to be a social workers. I wanted what I call additional skills. My Native American navigator, for instance, worked at the U for 10 plus years. Her discipline was food sourcing. So she knows every food shelf, every cultural pantry. Um, Bringing that to the police department to kind of tie it to another story I told. Um, if an officer showed up at a house that was, yes, for that question, yes, my LGBTQIA plus navigator. She had 20 years experience working with homeless youth, and so she worked with the camps. She knows all the I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. She knows all of the shelters and things like that. That's like her jam. So that's her added value, bring it to the police department of having someone who can say, hey, when if you do work with the homeless camp, this is how you should approach it. She's really good with language. She's really good connecting with people. She actually has become a SWAT navigator, a SWAT negotiator because of her communication skills. So she's got a third skill that she brings to the department. How would someone reach out to a navigator? On the old city website, we used to have our own page. I don't know if they've got it set up yet. Otherwise, they could call me. I can. I don't know. Catherine, I'll send you a list of phone numbers and names and emails if that makes sense. I'll give it off the email, the original email,
Great.
just so
Thank
everybody
you.
you can share it. Um, and I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question? I think was Leslie said. And
yeah.
I'm sorry, Leslie, if I didn't answer all of it.
Oh no, that's fine. I'm just it's just sort of a question of how you yourself become somewhat of a navigator. I mean, obviously not on the level that your navigators do, but within your own communities, because to me that just seems so overwhelming. And so where do you begin? And so
Oh,
that's
well, first things first, at least for me, it was just the idea of identifying, um, how can I put it? And once again, it's just linkages in my head. So I started out, at least for me, uh, a civilization is measured by how it treats its elders, its youngest, and those who are most vulnerable. So I start there. I tried to partner and learn about those groups that are doing that work, and then I narrow down. Um, from there, you can find layers of issues, and organizationally, I try to divine those out and then share those with leadership because, and also offer solutions because in many cases, the biggest thing a navigator can do is point people in the right direction to find resources or information. That's the key component is in many cases, people just don't know where to turn. And sometimes if you can hold their hand for just a little bit of the journey, it gets them going. And that's all they need. So for me and my team, that's one of the biggest things we can do is we're going to be here. We're going to hold your hand. We'll get you started. And if we need to hold your hand all the way through, we can do that. But in most cases, it's just getting you pointed in the right direction and let you go. That's I think that's where you start is just, even if it's on an individual level, it's being able to sort of acknowledge that and understand that, hey, uh, I'm just here to be a cipher sometimes. I'm just here to kind of, hear from you, digest it, and then transfer that to someone else, or like I said, point you in the right direction. So that's the way I saw it. And it's just a matter of where you're at what do you recognize and what can you do? I think, it's Minneapolis, so there's a bunch of different things going on. That's why it was built the way it was built.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I want to be aware of time, and it's 11:31. This hour just, flew by. We have so much more that we could talk about. So I want to thank our panelists for sharing their stories and their knowledge and their expertise. Um, and I think this is just the beginning of really a number of conversations about this. And I am so grateful for MIVPAC and for the group of people that continue to come to these webinars, because I think that we are building this both individual community connectedness, but also really incredible organizational community connectedness, learning about all of these wonderful programs that are available, these experts that are in our state and in our MIVPAC community that we can reach out to and have these cups of coffee and conversations about where our work overlaps, and even where it doesn't overlap, but where we can learn from each other in this important work that we all do. So I thank everyone for being here, and we will be sending out, an invitation for our next conversation, which will be centered around economic justice, which will be, I'm sure, just as interesting and valuable as this was. So thank you so much to Noelle, Sarah, and Glenn, and for everyone for attending. And we look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you for
Have a
having
great
me.
day.